There's an old saying that timing is everything. And while we usually think of it in terms of opportunities and success, sometimes timing determines something far more fundamental, whether we live or die. Today we're going to explore 3 stories of ordinary people whose lives were forever changed by being in the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. These aren't stories of bad decisions or risky behavior. These are stories of people who were simply going about their normal routines when fate intervened in the cruelest possible way. But before we get into that, if you enjoy the unexplained, forgotten and twisted, then you found the right channel, because these are exactly the types of stories that I tell here every week. So don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on all notifications to never miss a story. Alright, here we go. On Friday evening, on October 15, 1999, Nicholas White was working late on the 43rd floor of the McGraw-Hill building in New York City's Rockefeller Center. The 34-year-old production manager at Businessweek magazine had just watched a baseball game on the break room TV, and now he was back at his desk trying to wrap up a project he's been working on before the weekend starts. Around 11 o'clock, he decided he needed a cigarette. Nicholas told a colleague he'd be right back and headed for the elevator. He took the express elevator down to the lobby, walked outside into the crisp fall air, and had his cigarette while watching the late-night Manhattan traffic pass him by. When he finished, Nicholas walked back into the building, nodded hello to the janitor who was buffing the floors, and headed back to the elevator bank he'd been using for the last 15 years. He entered the car number 30, the third elevator on the left, and pressed number 43. The door closed and the elevator began to accelerate upward. 2 days later, on Sunday, a security guard at the same building where Nicholas worked was going through his routine of checking the building CCTV monitors. It was around 4 p.m. and the building was quiet, as it usually was on weekends. So the security guard cycled through the various camera feeds, empty stairwells, vacant parking garages, deserted hallways. Then he switched to the elevator cameras. 4 boxes appeared on a screen showing the interiors of elevators 29, 30, 31, and 32. In the top right box, elevator 30, he saw something that didn't really make sense to him. There was a man lying on the floor of the elevator. At first it seemed a little bit weird because elevator 30 was marked as out of order in a security log, so seeing someone in there was highly unusual, and the simple fact that the man was lying on the floor made it more than unusual. It made it very concerning. So the security guard immediately reached to the intercom and pressed the dial button to the elevator 30. It turned out that 2 days earlier, after Nicholas White finished his smoke break and was going in the elevator back up, something happened to the elevator power supply, which caused his car to stop before it reached its destination on the 43rd floor. And since it was an express elevator, it meant that there was no designated stops at all until the floor 39. So no door openings, nothing. After you entered it on the ground floor in the lobby, you were committed to traveling to at least floor 39. And if elevators stopped before that, you would be stuck in a literally concrete shaft without any exit. And that is exactly what happened to Nicholas. The elevator stopped at floor 13. Nicholas's entire ordeal was recorded on the CCTV cameras inside the elevator, and it tells a truly disturbing tale, documenting every stage of Nicholas's deteriorating condition. So in the first few minutes, the footage showed Nicholas doing what anyone would do in that situation. He was pressing buttons repeatedly, he was trying to reach somebody on the intercom, he was pressing the alarm button, but what Nicholas didn't know was that for reasons that were never truly established, the security desk that should have received his emergency call heard nothing. The footage showed him pacing the small car, which was about 6 by 6 feet, with frustration visibly building up. By sunrise on Saturday, Nicholas had been trapped for 8 hours, and the footage showed him sitting on the floor with his head in his hands, trying to figure out what to do. He tried to force the door open, and it worked. He was able to fully spread the elevator doors, but beyond that was just a solid shaft wall. The express elevator was trapped in a dead zone between floors where there was no openings, no way out, just the concrete on all sides. Then you can see him attempting to climb out through the ceiling hatch, but it was locked from the outside as a security measure. The most bizarre part happened on Saturday afternoon. The footage showed that cars 29, 31, and 32 were being serviced, and a maintenance worker came in with a stepladder to fix something, but all 3 elevators were down in the lobby, while Nicholas was stuck high above, so he couldn't hear anything that was going on downstairs, and people downstairs could not hear Nicholas. By Saturday night, Nicholas had been trapped for over 30 hours, without food, without water, without anything. When he left his desk on Friday, he was planning to be gone for 5 or maybe 10 minutes, so he left everything in his desk, including his watch. It was 1999, so cell phones were not as common as they are today, so he had no idea what time it was, if it was day or night, and how long he'd been in the elevator. The footage mostly showed him now lying on the floor. Every few hours he would stand up and scream at the top of his lungs, then he would collapse back to the floor to conserve what little energy he had left. Then at hour 41, he could be seen standing up and approaching the intercom. This was when the security worker finally saw him on a screen and called the elevator. Nicholas was taken to the hospital and physically recovered within a few days. He had severe dehydration and some kidney issues from not having water for so long, but nothing that would cause permanent physical damage. Nicholas sued the building management and the elevator maintenance company, filing for $25 million in damages. The case dragged on for 4 years and was finally settled out of court. He received a settlement that sources said was barely 6 figures, nowhere near what his lawyers had hoped for. The building argued that the power dip was unforeseeable and that their security systems had failed in a way nobody could have predicted. He also left his job at the building, and according to some sources, he never smoked again. Thomas and Pauline Morell had lived in the same small house in West Ham district of London, England for years. It was a Victorian house with 2 bedrooms upstairs and a kitchen that barely fit the table. But it was their home and they loved it. Thomas was 32, he worked at the local factory, and he had grown up just a few streets away from where he lived right now. They knew all the neighbors, they had routines, their local shops. Life wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs. Then, late in 1967, a letter arrived that changed their established routine life completely. The city council was condemning their entire street. Not just their house, the whole neighborhood was being demolished to make way for new development. They had 3 months to move out. When Thomas and Pauline went to the housing office to discuss their options, they were told they'd been allocated a flat in a brand new tower block called Ronan Point. 22 stories tall, still under construction, but nearly finished. The housing officer made it sound like they won the lottery. Central heating, hot water, a proper bathroom, even a garbage chute so you don't have to go downstairs to take out your trash. But Thomas and Pauline didn't want to leave 22 stories in the air. They wanted to stay in the house on the ground somewhere that felt normal to them. So they said no thank you, they'd rather have something else. The housing officer seemed a little confused by this. He made some notes and said he'd be in touch. 2 weeks later, another letter came. They went back to the office and explained again that they didn't want to live in a tower block. The man behind the desk told them high-rise living was the future and they have to get used to it, and everyone loved it once they tried it. This went on all winter. Every few weeks, the same offer would come back, and every time Thomas and Pauline would refuse it. By the 4th or 5th time, they were getting frustrated. Thomas tried explaining that he didn't like heights, that the idea of being dependent on elevators made him nervous, but nothing worked. Eventually, their house was scheduled for demolition. The date was set. Their neighbors had already started moving out, accepting apartments in various tower blocks across East London. By the 7th time they refused the flat, the tone of the letter had changed. It wasn't an offer anymore, more like notification or where they would be living. The demolition was happening whether they moved or not. They could take the flat in Ronan Point, or they could find their own accommodation, but either way, they had to be out by March. Thomas and Pauline didn't have savings for a deposit on a private rental, and they didn't have family with spare rooms. They were trapped, and they knew it. So when the 8th letter came, they finally gave in. After months of fighting, they agreed to move into Ronan Point. But here's where the things got even more frustrating to them. They didn't get the apartment they were promised. When they showed up with their belongings in March 1968, they were told there had been some reshuffling of allocations. They were now in flat 110 on the 22nd floor, the very top of the building. Ronan Point had only been open for 2 months, and you could tell. Everything still smelled like fresh paint and wet concrete. The elevators made these grinding noises that made Pauline grip Thomas' arm every time they rode them. The building manager kept saying it was normal, just the building settling, but it didn't sound normal. It sounded like something straining, something under extreme pressure. From their living room, they could see for miles across London, but Pauline couldn't look out without feeling dizzy. The wind up there was incredible. It would hit the building and make these howling sounds around the windows. Sometimes at night, they could hear the whole structure creaking like a ship at sea. Thomas would tell Pauline it was fine and all new buildings made sounds, but he was saying it mostly to convince Pauline, while he himself wasn't fully convinced. They met some of the neighbors, mostly young families with similar situations who had been forced out of their neighborhoods into this brave new world of high-rise living. Nobody seemed particularly happy about it, but everyone was trying to make the best of it. On May 16, 1968, at 5:45 in the morning, Ivy Hodge, who lived alone on the 18th floor, walked into her kitchen to make herself a cup of tea. She lit a match. In the next second, a massive blast slammed into her, knocking her backward and filling the entire apartment with heat and smoke. It turned out that this entire building was just a big accident waiting to happen. Several residents had complained about smelling gas in their flats for weeks. They called the building management, they reported it to anyone who would listen, and every time they were told that it was nothing, just new pipes, the smell would go away, and don't worry about it. But there was something to worry about, because the ventilation system that was supposed to carry any leaked gas safely outside hadn't been installed properly. Some of the vents were blocked with construction debris, others had been sealed up completely by workers who didn't understand what they were for. In Ivy Hodge's flat, gas had been slowly leaking from a faulty connection on her cooker all night long. With nowhere to ventilate, it had built up in her kitchen, creating an invisible cloud of explosive gas that just waited for a tiny little spark. When she struck that match to light her stove at 5:45 in the morning, the explosion was immediate and catastrophic. By pure miracle, Ivy Hodge survived. Her hands and face were burned, her ears were ringing so hard she could barely hear anything, but Ivy remained conscious. Somehow she managed to get to her feet, and that's when she realized just how much of her home was gone. Her entire living room wall had been blown out. Not cracked, not damaged. Gone. The blast blew out the entire exterior wall of her apartment, but that wall wasn't just any wall. It was a load-bearing wall, and this wall was holding all the floors above it. Ronan Point had been built using something called large panel system, basically a huge concrete slabs that were made in a factory and then crane fitted into the place and bolted together on site. It was faster and cheaper than traditional construction, but it had a fatal flaw. There was no redundancy in the structure. If one panel failed, there was nothing to redistribute the weight. The moment that wall disappeared, the floor above Evie's apartment had nothing holding it up. It fell straight down onto the rubble of her apartment. The impact was more than floor below could handle, so it collapsed too. Then the next floor, then the next, each one adding weight and speed to the destruction. Up on the 22nd floor, Thomas and Pauline Morell were still asleep, and for them there was no time to react and no chance to run. the structure beneath their bed just disappeared, and half of their apartment just vanished in a gap below. Everything from Ivy's 18th floor apartment up to the top of the building and all the way down to the ground fell in a clean vertical slice. 22 stories gone in about 10 seconds. Thomas and Pauline Morell were killed in a collapse instantly, as well as two other people, Thomas McCloskey and Edith Bridgestook, who lived in flat 85 on the 17th floor. The inquiry that followed left no mystery about what happened. Ronan Point had been flawed from the moment the first concrete panel was lifted into place. Weak joints, poor construction, blocked ventilation, and ignored reports of gas leaks. And caught in the center of all those failures were Thomas and Pauline Morell, two people who had tried again and again to steer clear of that tower, almost like they sensed something wasn't right long before anyone listened. Bureaucracy cornered them into a building they didn't trust, on the floor they didn't choose, and they never made it out. Ronan Point Tower stood for a few years after the collapse, but its weakened structure and shattered reputation led to its eventual demolition in 1986. In 2012, Jose Milena had been working at the Bumble Foods plant in Santa Fe Springs, California for 6 years. At 62 years old, the father of 6 from Wilmington knew every piece of equipment in that facility, every sound the machinery made, every routine that kept the production line moving. His job as a basket pusher meant he spent his shifts loading heavy baskets of sealed tuna cans into the massive industrial ovens that sterilized them. It was hard work, but after 6 years, he could do it literally with his eyes closed. On October 11, 2012, Milena arrived at the plant before dawn for his overnight shift, parking his car in the employee parking lot, and headed into the facility. The Santa Fe Springs plant operated around the clock, processing and canning tuna that would eventually end up on grocery store shelves across America. The night shift was smaller than the day crew, but everyone knew their roles, which allowed the factory to meet the consumer demand. The industrial ovens that Jose Milena worked with at Bumblebee factory were enormous. 35 feet long and 54 inches in diameter, essentially giant cylindrical pressure cookers, and they could hold around 12,000 pounds of canned tuna at the time. These retort ovens would heat up to 270 degrees Fahrenheit during a 2-hour sterilization cycle, killing any bacteria and ensuring that tuna was safe for consumption. Workers would use pallet jacks to push wheeled baskets loaded with cans into the ovens, then seal them up for the cooking process. Sometime before 5 a.m. that morning, Milena was assigned to load a particular oven. But when he went to begin the loading process, he noticed that something was wrong. The chain mechanism inside of the oven, the system that helped pull the heavy baskets to the cylindrical chamber, needed adjustment. This wasn't unusual. The equipment at the plant required constant minor maintenance and adjustments to make sure that it ran smoothly. And workers had been making these kind of adjustments inside the ovens for years. So Milena looked at it, he knew exactly how to fix it, so he looked around and he climbed inside to fix the chain. The opening was just large enough for a person to enter, and with the oven cold and empty, there was no immediate danger. He'd done it before a lot of workers did. At the same time, another employee was working nearby when he noticed Milena's pallet jack sitting unused next to the oven. So that worker looked around, but he didn't see Milena anywhere. He thought that Milena must be in a bathroom or stepped away for some reason. So he grabbed the pallet jack and began loading the oven with baskets of tuna. Within about 20 minutes, he had loaded approximately 12,000 pounds of canned tuna into the oven. Then he closed the heavy door, sealed it shut, and started the machine. Not long after, a supervisor noticed something odd. Why was this employee using Milena's pallet jack, and where was Milena? The supervisor hadn't seen him in a while, which was unusual. Milena was a reliable employee and always at his station. So the supervisor made an announcement over the plant's intercom system, calling for Milena, but received no response. Now concerned, employees began searching the facility. They checked the break rooms, the bathrooms, the loading docks. Someone went out to the parking lot and confirmed that Milena's car was still there, which meant he hadn't left and had to be somewhere in the plant. For about an hour and a half, workers searched every corner of the facility. Some were starting to worry that maybe he'd had a medical emergency somewhere, perhaps a heart attack in some isolated corner of the building. Finally, after exhausting nearly every possibility, one employee made a suggestion. What about the ovens? Specifically, what about the last oven that had been loaded that morning? The oven was still hot from its cycle. Workers actually had to wait another 30 minutes or so for it to cool down enough to safely open. When they finally unsealed the door and looked inside, they found Jose Molina's severely burned body among the baskets of sterilized tuna. Firefighters arrived at 7:20 in the morning and officially pronounced him dead at the scene. The investigation launched by the California Division of Occupational Health and Safety found a number of safety violations at this plant. The company hadn't properly identified the ovens as permit-required confined spaces. There were no lockout procedures to prevent the ovens from being turned on while someone was inside. No spotters were required when someone entered for maintenance. The investigation also uncovered that this wasn't the first serious accident at this plant. About a year earlier, an employee had a finger amputated after it got caught in a chute. Another worker had suffered a fractured skull after falling from the forklift. Bumble Foods eventually paid a $6 million settlement, the largest in California history for a workplace safety violation involving a single death. $3 million went to replacing all the old ovens with automated ones that didn't require workers to enter them. $1.5 million went to Molina's family, and another $1.5 million was paid in fines and penalties. And that's gonna be it for today. If you enjoyed today's stories, don't forget to like the video, click the subscribe button, and turn on all notifications to never miss the upload. Because every week we publish at least one story covering the unexplained, forgotten, or twisted. Our channel is new and growing because of viewers just like you who appreciate a good story. Stay curious, stay safe, my friends, and until next time.